It's been our fourth Yellow Car birthday, and we've always believed it's important to celebrate milestones. So we're very excited that you're joining us today. At Yellow Car, we work with schools from around the world to measure and design the lived experience of students, parents, and employees. And right from the beginning, we have learned from others around us, some very close to us, and some that we've looked up from afar, like Joe, because Joe, your work has been one of the intellectual foundations for much of what we have been building these last few years. And for many of you who don't know him, Joe Pine is an internationally acclaimed author, speaker, management advisor, and the co-founder of Strategic Horizons. He's best known as the co-author, together with James Gilmore, of the best-selling book, The Experience Economy, and his other books include Authenticity, Mass Customization, and Infinite Possibility. And more recently, his newly published book, Transformation Economy, which will guide much of our conversation today. Joe also lectures in a strategic technology leadership program at Northeastern University and is a senior fellow of the European Center for the Experience Economy. And for those of you who've been part of our workshop sessions, you might have heard us referring to Joe as the godfather of experience strategy. So for those of you who are joining us today, the structure will be a guided conversation by David with Joe for around 30 minutes, and we'll be talking about human flourishing in education. And from there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So feel free to use the chat. If anything comes to mind, we'll keep an eye on that. And at the end of our conversation, we will have an opportunity to share some very exciting updates about Yellow Car as we enter our 5th year as a company. So we hope the next hour will be time well spent. Joe, it's a pleasure to welcome you. And David, over to you.
Great. Thank you. It really is wonderful to see Joe here today, but there's also so many familiar faces from literally all over the world. It's nice that we can come together to celebrate Yellow Car's 4th birthday. So thank you for, I should say that Suzette was determined that we had party hats and balloons. The last minute they failed to get delivered, so unfortunately. But we're really here for the first part of today to talk with Joe. If you've been to any of our workshops over the last 4 years, I think probably 96% of them have had a picture of Joe.
Well, it's very gratified to hear that, and that you based a lot of this on my work. So it's very appreciative to hear that. And I'm glad to be with you, Suzette, and everyone else today.
So I think where we want to take this conversation is really to think about your new book. So if you haven't seen it, here's the plug, Transformation Economy. I read it a few weeks ago, just as it came out, and it really was something that I think was a powerful read and really confirmed some of the things that we've often found ourselves talking about. I think many people will know your name, Joe, and they will have seen your face, but maybe it's worth beginning and just thinking about what is it like to wake up and be Joe Pine on a core pay.
It's a good thing, David. I love being so yeah. If you my typical day in the office right now, I'm actually on semi-vacation on the Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, which is where basically I work a half day and then I play a half day off in golf. But even when I'm in my office, I often try to get out for golf in the afternoon. I figure if I can work till like 3 or 4 and then play 18 holes, that's a great day. But that's maybe once a week in the summer. But I typically get up and do email and catch up on LinkedIn and things that happened overnight, or come in from Europe and Asia. And then if I'm in a writing mode, I'm writing the book, and then I continue to write on the book, on the ideas, on Substack, then I try and spend as much time as writing on writing as I can. And then eventually I get sort of tired in the afternoon, and then I stop that and I go back to other putsy stuff like email and whatnot. And maybe I'll get a second wind and keep writing.
That was actually going to be one of my questions as to whether or not are you an early bird writer or a night owl or right in the middle of the day, or does it depend?
Yeah, I do think it would be better if I did start right off in the morning and skipped all the other stuff, but it just gnaws at me. Knowing there's people that want to talk about something and so forth, so I typically do that. But there are times when ideas will hit. Sometimes I wake up and I can't stop thinking. I have an idea, and so I'll get up and I'll do a little writing on that. And sometimes later at night, I used to do that more often, where when the kids were growing up, where I'd work and then I'd be with the kids, and then when they went to bed, I'd go back for another hour or two. But I try to avoid that now. as I get older.
And I guess that love of writing is something, because you've written, I think, was it 11 books or?
It depends on how you count it. It's 5 to 10. I mean, counting experience coming once or 3 times because we updated and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I said 11, so there's definitely one more book in you then.
Right, somewhere. That's right, exactly.
So I think one of the things that obviously as you become a writer, I mean, some of that must have been there perhaps when you were at school. I'm curious, before we dig into some of your foundational ideas. Here we are, many of us educators. Tell us a little bit about what school was like for you.
Well, school, I was always good at school, right? Always smart. But I didn't always apply myself. I basically got A's and B's until 2 things that happened in my, I want to say sophomore year with fit, but would one have physics in sophomore? It seems like more of a biology was sophomore, physics was junior year, right? 11th grade. So anyway, so one of the things is I got a D on a physics test, and I went, "What? You don't get D's? What the heck is this?" And went to the teacher. It's Mr. Dorn something. I can't remember what's more Dorn Durf or something, but it's like, what the heck's going on? He said, "Joe, you're so much better than this. You can do much better." Right. And so it basically did it as a wake up call to tell me to start applying myself. And my parents around the same time did the same thing, thinking about college. Hey, it'd be good if you get A's, maybe you get a scholarship and so forth. So from then on out, I just got straight A's because I just made sure to do it. Except for one class, like my last semester in English, and this name I remember, Polly Rykowski, gave me a B, and I absolutely didn't deserve it. I did A work, and I just convinced she was mad that I didn't go out for one of her plays. That she was the theater person. I didn't go out for one of her plays, so that was the only B that I got. But I was good. One of the things is I was good at both English and science and math, right? And that proved to be a good thing. I read books in high school. I ate up all the books that we had to read for class. I also read many other things, and that instilled, as early as high school, a desire to someday be a writer.
As many of people here will listen and know that if they've heard us talk, we often talk about the peak end rule and about how, the difference between what you remember and what you experience. And I think It's interesting just listening to your story about, as you look back over your K-12 education, some of the things that, you're remembering compared with what you actually experienced. And that, D might have been a trough in the experience, and then other memorable teachers that might be peaks of the experience. So as you moved into this whole world, and maybe at the beginning you weren't calling it experience strategy, but it's come to be a term that we've become familiar with and associated with. In one of your, clearly at the beginning, you talked about this idea of the progression of economic value. And, I think there would be some people on the call who maybe haven't really heard that or heard us explain it, but still not really understood. Can you say something about what that means and why this is so important, really understand what is happening when it comes to experience?
Yeah, it's the core framework. We often call it the mother of all frameworks, but the core framework in the experience economy and in the new book, The Transformation Economy, that describes macroeconomically what has been going on in the world for millennia, where in the beginning there were commodities, the basis of the agrarian economy. Then we shifted to goods, physical, tangible things that we touch and feel, the basis of the industrial economy. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, the developed world shifted into a service economy where services became the predominant economic offering. And one of the things that happened when services came to the fore is that goods became commoditized, being treated like a commodity. People don't care who makes it. They're about the brand or the features are all pretty much the same anyway, right? It's when they come to care really about price and convenience. They want to buy you on price and convenience. You don't have differentiation, right? That's what a commodity is. It means no differentiation. And so many manufacturers shifted into providing more and more services. And then eventually services started to be commoditized as well. And that's when experiences came to the fore. In 1999, when we first published the book, my partner Jim Gilmore and I talked about the emerging, the nascent, the forthcoming experience economy. But by 2011, when we first updated it, we said it's now here, right? We now see everybody prefers experiences over things. And in fact, people want goods and services to be commoditized, to be bought at the lowest possible price and the greatest possible convenience, to spend their hard-earned money and their hard-earned time on the experiences that they value. So the experience economy is when experiences become the predominant economic offering. And economists, most economists, or I say most, but like virtually all economists, only identify commodities, goods, services as distinct economic offerings. They lump everything else into services. Bless you. But services today are 80% of GDP around the world. They're 80% of employment, again, in all developed countries. And it's really too much. You got to split that bucket up and recognize that experiences are a distinct economic offering. That's why it's the progression of economic value. A distinct economic offering as distinct from services as services are from goods. And from the very beginning, we identified that there'd be one more offering, that experiences could be commoditized as well. But there's also this notion of life-changing experiences that change us in some way, and that's what we call transformation. So transformation is the fifth and final economic offering in this progression of economic value, where you're helping people using experiences as a raw material to guide people to achieve their aspirations, to become who they want to become, to flourish as human beings.
Yeah, it's when I read the Experience Economy for the first time, it was like a great movie, and there was this teaser for this future book that might come. But I know that
That's how we designed it, basically.
So it's a great kind of, you're waiting for season 2, and I think one of the questions that you perhaps raise as you write the transformation economy is, maybe it took 25 years to write it and to get to a point. I think you talk about the world wasn't ready for it.
Yes.
Why now, do you think? Why is the world potentially ready for the idea of transformation economy that it wasn't back in 1999?
Yeah, well, it's that transformation is a big, scary word, and it's something that we weren't used to thinking about. There are both supply and demand reasons. On the supply side, experiences started to be commoditized as well. Theme restaurants are really the first place you see that, but tourism destinations where people say, been there, done that, those are commoditized experiences. A colleague and I wrote a Harvard Business Review article in June 2024, where we talked about how Starbucks was commoditizing itself based on what it had been doing over the last 5 to 8 years. And I'm sure it was pure coincidence, but 3 weeks after that article, they fired the CEO and then hired somebody who is actually turning it around and coming back to that great third place experience that it can have. And then companies have seen the opportunity that lies, how much more value there is in transformative experiences. And one of the things that I helped co-found the World Experience Organization. And at the World Experience Summits that we've had over the last 5 years or 4 years, I think it is, I talked to all these experience designers on the campfires that we have. And to a person, everyone talks about wanting to design transformative experiences, not just merely memorable experiences. So that desire is there on the supply side. And on the demand side, I think in particular coming out of COVID is that we realized that it was experiences that we missed during that time. And we didn't want merely memorable ones. We also wanted meaningful ones. And meaningful is sort of a half step towards transformation. In fact, one of the things I discovered during the writing of the book, is there's really 4 levels of experiences. There's memorable experiences that engage who we are. There are meaningful experiences that connect with who we are in some way. There are transporting experiences that allows us to get out of who we are, have awe and get into flow and transcendent euphoric experiences in that. And then finally, there are transformative experiences that change who we are. And increasingly that desire for going up there and wanting more transformative changes. It's also the fact that because time is so scarce, scarce is the wrong word. Time is not scarce. Time is plentiful, right? You've got 24 hours a week. But our view of that is that we are so busy in these days that the time becomes more precious. Even though that's wrong also, we spend a lot less time at work than we did 100 years ago. People just don't realize that. And 100 years ago, people would spend 50 to 60 hours a week just on things that appliances do, just on housework and cooking and so forth. And now we don't have that time. We can spend it on other things. But because we make so much money, right? We in the Western world in particular, we live lives of abundance with so much more money. Even the poor today live at much higher levels than kings did, hundreds of years ago. That we view time as more precious, and so we want to spend it well. We're more attuned to where we're going to spend that time, and we want to spend it on things that we can then invest it in becoming better versions of ourselves.
So I'm wondering, I would imagine that there's some people sitting on this webinar today, on this event, and thinking to themselves, but we work in a school. I mean, we are in the business of transformation,
Right. Transformation,
human flourishing, and this is what we do. This is our core product, if you like, is that we have students, and we want them to be different when they leave than when they came in. And so I'm wondering as you reflect on the book that you've just written and the context that many of us will be working in, what are some of the things that we might learn if you think about that interpretive lens that you are bringing? What might we learn both about the educational endeavor that we are involved in, but also the operational endeavor of, in a sense, the business of running a school? How might we find some points of connection?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, first of all, is to think about how you ascend to the proposition that you're in the business of transformation. And I'll say business, and maybe many school people want to reject that word, but it's a bit, you get paid, it's a business, right? So you're in the business of transformation. That is what you've been hired to do. And how well you do that impacts individual human lives in an incredibly impactful way. It's just amazing to think about the possibilities and how many people have been changed by individual teachers and individual moments for both good and ill, as it turns out. Also, in chapter 2 of the book, I talk about how the raison d'etre of business is, in fact, to foster human flourishing. That's why business exists at all. That's why anybody buys anything from anybody else, whether it's a commodity, good, service, experience, or transformation. Is that we think that by exchanging money in our wallet or in our purse or in our account for some economic offering, that we'll be better off in some way. And sometimes we're deluded in what makes us better off and all that. We can talk about that. But basically, that's why we do it. And so to understand that's why you exist is to help individual human beings flourish in their lives. Now, the interesting thing with schools is that who you're transforming is not actually the customer. The customer is the government unit, it's the state, the federal government, the state, the county, the individual municipality, and so forth, as well as the parents who are sending their kids to school because they want them to flourish in their lives. The students are actually the beneficiaries of that. So nonetheless, so you have to keep in account what parents desire for their kids, and not just ignore that as immaterial. You need to keep in mind who's running the schools. The government also has a responsibility to create productive citizens who flourish in their life. Now, they're not always thinking correctly about that yet. Like businesses don't think correctly about it yet, but hopefully that will come. But it is about human flourishing, that you take a child and help that child have wings that allows them to thrive in life. Right? That's the basic idea of what you are doing. In that same chapter, I talk about the three, I call them, start with 3 spheres of transformation, which basically goes back to the old English proverb of being healthy, wealthy, and wise. And of course, wise is down the plate about education. And I expand those, and it's useful to think about because all of these, I call them spheres because they're amorphous, they overlap, they connect in the middle. I think it's important to think about all 4 of them in terms of school, which is health is really about health and well-being. That health care is the means to which we have well-being in our lives, and we live lives of good health, that we're capable of doing the things that we want to do. 2, wealth is about wealth and prosperity, that we're prosperous in our lives, and money is the means to that end. And as school teachers, we can affect well-being and prosperity as well as wisdom and knowledge, which is the 3rd sphere. Or I would say knowledge and wisdom, because knowledge is the means to creating wisdom, which is about the outcomes to which you apply that knowledge. That's the core of what you're doing. But well-being and prosperity are very important as well, and you affect that as teachers and as administrators. And then finally, there's the one that the old proverb didn't take into account, which is perhaps the most important, which is purpose and meaning. Right, purpose and meaning. That as human beings, we need meaning in our lives, and it's a core thing to understand how we gain that meaning. We need to have a personal purpose about why we exist in the world, and schools are I'll use this term, a chrysalis for understanding who we are and what the potentials are to become and developing that purpose in life. I knew in seventh grade on, I was going to become a computer programmer, right? And I did. That's what I did. Got an applied math degree, worked for IBM. But then I recognized that there are other greater possibilities out, but those were set up by many school experiences that I had, that I was in fact good at English and at writing as well as at math, that I did want to see the big picture of things was one of the things that happened to me in school. I never wanted to go deep. I wanted to look across things, and that gave me the sort of the pattern recognition that allowed me to develop frameworks and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think many people here will find what you're saying about schools' central purpose is about health, well-being, having a sense of purpose in life is very encouraging, because I think, what we're finding, and if we compare that with our customers, as in your language, perhaps the parents, often the tension is that the job that they want to be done is something that is not articulated in that way. If we think about the book, there's one thing that really made me wonder at one point, because I think at a certain point in the book you talk about human flourishing is a community endeavor, which makes you think about the school community, and at the same time you're talking quite a lot about the hero's journey, and it feels more individual. So I guess there's a question around, when we think about the journey of transformation, is it a lonely journey, or is it a journey in community with others? Where does it sit?
It all depends. It depends on what journey. We go on multiple journeys in our life. I do say that the mega trend of the progression of economic value is individualization. And for one reason, what I didn't talk about before is that you mentioned, or Suzette mentioned earlier, that my first book was mass customization. It's about efficiently serving customers uniquely, giving them everything exactly what they want at a price they're willing to pay. And it's customization that enabled me to discover these progression. It's the antidote to commoditization. Customizing turns a good into a service experience, and an experience into a transformation. So that's individual important. But also recognize that commodities, goods, services exist outside of us. Right? Things that happen, we extract out of the ground with commodities. We hardly ever touch commodities. More goods or physical things that we touch and feel. Services or activity performs on us, like cutting our hair, or on our objects, like changing the oil in our car. But experiences for the first time happen inside of us, right? It's a reaction to the events that are staged in front of us. You engage us. The experience happens in here, with the memory as the hallmark of that experience. With transformation, you change people from the inside out. That's why the economic function of transformations is guide. Now, you can't change somebody, they change themselves. And you guide them to be able to change. And so you are changing people from the inside out. So it's a very much an individual thing, right? It's incredibly individual, and it creates the individual. With transformations, the customer is the product, right? They're the outcome of everything that you do. Everything else doesn't matter. The inputs don't matter, only the outcome of achieving their aspirations directly or as a beneficiary of others. And eventually, the older you get in school, the more the individual takes over their aspirations versus the parental and governmental aspirations as well. So it is a very important thing, but nonetheless, few of us change by ourselves. Even the classic hero journey, right, requires that mentor, which is the guide that helps you along your journey. But there is at some point where you're in that crucible of the journey where you are all alone and you have to do it yourself, right? Yes, that's true. And that's true with every transformation, because again, we're changing ourselves. But within a community, there are so many transformations that are so much easier to do when we have the accountability, when we have the support, when we have the participation of others that are often undergoing, the same sort of transformation as us. So it's not a neither or. It's really a both thing in terms of how transformations happen.
Mm. There was another part of the book that sticks out in my memory. Of you talk about the Net Simpler score. Now, many of us may have heard about the Net Promoter Score. Would you recommend Company X? We talk about the Felt Experience Index as an index we use with scores, but the Net Simpler score made me wonder about that connection between simplicity and transformation. Do you think it would be fair to say that in a world and with schools that tend to be quite complex places, is there a link between our ability to make things simpler for people and the likelihood that they would experience some kind of transformation?
Yeah, I think that's sort of axiomatic. The Net Simpler score was an example of Crown Worldwide that had transformed based off of a meaningful purpose that they created, they ascended to, that was really around making things simpler for their businesses, and say, well, let's have a Net Simpler score. How much simpler can we make this? And I'm not a fan of NPS, by the way, in measuring things. But I think I think it is axiomatic. The simpler you make things, then the easier that transformation is going to be. And to understand, help your aspirants, as I like to call them, to understand what those possibilities are in simple terms. And obviously, again, the younger you are in school, the simpler it needs to be. You can add on layers of complexity as you go up. And there may be particular times where understanding the true complexity of things is important, because you might not make that choice. Otherwise, if you knew how very difficult it would be or how low the probabilities of it were. But often that also is when people, the best in people come out and they succeed against all the odds.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you also talk about these types of transformation. You talk about enhancing, expanding, enriching, and altering as almost kind of four levels. What I found so useful about that was that it helped me think about the almost the difference between the incremental transformation journey that people might be on compared with the exponential change. And it felt like there was, and I think about the journey that students are on, that families are on in schools. I'm wondering, what are some of the things that we might say could be examples of the journey that we need to use your term, guide families and students along, that touch upon some of those levels, if you like?
Well, you probably know the answer. I do, David. So let me set up some context, and then we can figure out some examples together. The first of all, to understand that it's a framework on different types of aspirations. And one basic thing to understand is that all transformation is identity change. You are changing people's identities. I think that's the first slide of that chapter 3. In fact, all transformation is identity change. We may change people from sad to happy, let's say, or even from cold to warm, from hungry to satiated, and all those. But those are changes in state. They're transitions, not transformations, which are changes in identity. And so what that framework recognizes is that you can have the change in identity can be larger or small, or can be a large or small scale. It can also be enhancing a current level of identity or adding a whole new level of identity. So the enhancing transformations are the smallest, right? They're small in scale. They work on a current level identity. You become better at something, so it's something that students would have interest in. And then you're helping them explore that further and adding some level of increase in the scale and the identity of it. So maybe some interest in say geography, and you're helping them, with getting them a world atlas and a map, letting them explore on things to enhance that where they say, hey, I really love geography. It becomes a part of their identity. When that becomes large scale, it's when it's expanding, right? And that's where you might think of things that you want to greatly increase. So maybe expanding transformations happen with every grade level, right? That you are getting so much better in math and math ability you're able to do, so much better in your writing and your spelling and so forth. So that's a lot of expanding transformations where you've got a core skill, a core capability, a core element of identity, and then you're first enhancing it, but then expanding it to a great level. The other side is when it is a new level of identity. And so enriching is about cultivating a new level of identity, something they didn't know. So where they may first express an interest in something, and then you help them become that something. And you think of where it might be a language. Maybe you fell in love with some Chinese Chinese animated movies and that. And so you want to learn Chinese, and that's a big, big thing. But you may then start to go to class and learn in a little bit of time. That's a class that you add. The biggest ones are the altering transformation, which is really about a metamorphosis, right? A large scale change in core identity. And there's no times in anyone's life where they undergo more metamorphoses than during primary education, right? And often maybe more once a year, it may be. If you think about who they are at the beginning and who they are at the end, and just add that up. I remember one time, one of the things I love studying on the side is linguistics. And they said, if you simply add up how many words people know when they're like 5 and how many words they know when they're like 10, you realize they're learning 3 to 5 new words a day, which is always amazing to me, but it has to be that way to get there. In the same way, how many elements of identity do we have when we graduate that we did not have when we started out? And you'll see it's multiple metamorphoses that we're undergoing every year. And to understand what those are, some of those, one of the other frameworks in the book is about the catalyst for transformation. And I always thought of it in the first book, in the experience comment, when we talk about transformation, it's like the bluebird of happiness comes down and lights in your shoulder and whispers in your ear, oh, you want to aspire something? Okay, let's go help you do that. But in fact, there's many different reasons. A lot of it having to do with serendipity, but also a lot having to do with trauma. And there's a lot going on in people and kids' lives outside of school. There's trauma that happens, and with trauma, you think of normally you're trying to go up and gain new things to go from where you are today to what you want to be. But with trauma, as you're here, you go immediately down, and now you have to recover. You have to become whole again. You'll never be that same person. You had a metamorphosis. You've changed. Right? Your core identity is forever changed. But you can become a whole person. You can recover from that again, even a better, higher level of person, and being attuned to the trauma that happens in people's lives and how much more work and compassion it takes to help people recover from that. I think is an important thing in schools.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That in a way, it reminds me that sometimes our journey of transformation as individuals, particularly if we look at students and families in schools, is not necessarily linear.
Right.
And the path towards that, becoming someone or we talk about becoming who we're meant to be, is not necessarily a straight line of incremental steps in that kind of almost platonic way that we might have once imagined. So I'm wondering for schools here who are thinking, yeah, there's some interesting ideas about, transformation and as a kind of enhanced version of the experience economy, that we know that school is about an experience. We know that we need to work to ensure that we're seeing school not just as a delivery of a service, but as an experience and potentially a transformative one. How would you say a school should start to think about measuring that? What are some of the questions that might be worth coming to mind as school ponders, like, are we really delivering transformative experiences for people in our community?
Yeah, so it's very important to mention the outcomes. So again, the customer is the product. All that inputs don't matter, only outcomes. So how do you measure those outcomes? Now, there's many outcomes that you can measure via tests and exams, right? That you can understand how well you are progressing on certain levels in that way. But many outcomes are qualitative. It doesn't mean you can't measure them, but if they're qualitative, you measure them qualitatively, which can be done on an individual basis. It can be done on a survey basis, but it is important to recognize what the aspiration is, right? So how do you measure quality? We got to know where they are today and what they want to become, right? And I call this a diagnosis, that just use the medical term. And you need to think about that for every individual, right? Any year class during the school year, where are they today, which can be largely based on where they were when they ended the previous school year. Hopefully there's things learned there that you can now apply. And then what is the goals that they want to become over this school year? And some of those again will be what the government wants to have, right? Who's paying for the schools often. Some of it will be what the parents want them to have, and some will be what they want themselves. And the older they get, the more important that becomes, and the lesser the other becomes, in my mind. Right. And so to understand them, and so you can know in general what the government wants. You can talk to the parents about what they want. Are there particular issues that they have? You know, with in the U.S. you always say little Johnny is the little kid. Are there any issues with little Johnny? And anything that he's expressed interest in, you know, ask them questions that you don't normally have with parents, and then ask little Johnny himself what it is that you're desiring to have. And again, it's something you generally have to draw out of them, which of course is the meaning of education, by the way. If you go back to the Latin, right, educare means draw out, not put in. So you to draw out of them, because they don't generally know what their aspirations are, but there's exercises, there's things you could take them through, experiences you can take them through to help them figure that out. And then you've got something that you can measure against on an individual basis. I bet that sounds like a lot more work, but it's going to be worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of reminds me almost like the flip side of some of what you're talking about in terms of in the time well spent ideas that you've already brought to publication in various places around. Maybe this is more the time well invested it's the student themselves.
Yes.
Reflecting, is this time well invested? Am I becoming the person that I'm here on earth to be?
Yeah, and I mean, that's incredibly important, is to recognize that they're investing their time. So one of the things, this may be a paradox, but one of the things that you need to try to do is to instill intrinsic motivation. Right? The best students are motivated intrinsically. You do all these things to try and motivate them extrinsically, and it'll only work to a degree. And the question is, how do you get that flywheel going inside of people where they want to learn? And intrinsically, and that's the way I became eventually. I just soaked things up. And is there a way that you can help instill that? And if so, then everything else becomes so much more easy to accomplish.
Joe, there's so many things that, having read the book, I could continue to discuss with you, but I want to make sure we have some time to let other people ask some questions and to kind of engage. Maybe there are things that have been talked about that people want to pick up on. So I'm going to hand back over to Suzette to take the conversation from here.
Yeah, this was fascinating to listen to. I have been keeping an eye on the chat, and Bambi Bats is asking, in a school, is there a difference between transformation and growth as the purpose, or is that semantics?
I would say there's a high overlap. Maybe it's a Venn diagram with a high overlap. All transformation is growth in some way, but not all growth is potentially transformational, or we may use the term for different things. I mean, I think of growth, you think of maturity in something, but maybe I'll take it back. Maybe I'll say, if you look back at whether it's enriching, enhancing, altering, and the other one's not coming, expanding, right? Then all growth is that way, right? It's all out in some way. And so maybe, yes, it is all transformation, unless it's just, again, a change in state as opposed to a change in identity.
It almost makes me reflect on that difference between what David was talking, the incremental growth that people might be feeling, or that exponential transformation, right? That is that chrysalis that you've been talking about. Yeah. I also can't help to reflect when we talk about the school experience, and we're in a school, we often talk about intentionality. And even though schools might be in the business of transformation, I can't help but wonder how schools can be more intentional about the role that they play in guiding those transformations for their students. Are there perhaps questions, or maybe a question that you can think of, that schools should ask themselves to get better at guiding transformations, or at least to be more intentional about it?
Well, I think you're exactly right, Suzette. Being intentional is incredibly important. Something I talk about in the reflection at the end of the book. And it's sort of weaved in throughout, is you need to be intentional, starting with the intention of, what business am I in? Recognize that you really are about transformations. And so I guess getting back to intention, exactly, the question to ask is, why am I here? That's the question you should be asking. Why am I here? right? Is it just as an individual teacher, just so I can make a living and I can spend the rest of my life someplace? Or is it more of a calling? Is there a real purpose to what you're doing? For the school itself, why am I here? Is it just to pass people through the system? So I get paid by every student that goes by and we can pay all these salaries and so forth? Or is it to make a difference in the lives of each one of those students? And if you ask that, then I think you'll quickly get to answers that will help you be much more transformational than you were before.
I'm looking at a question from Lucy on another branch of this. This would be a really interesting concept to explore, especially when considering the complexities of school brand identity as a whole, and how the evolving identities of individuals, teams, and groups within a school community can shape, influence, and at times redefine a broader brand identity. It's a nice reflection.
That's very nice. Since you used the term reflection twice here, and I used it once, let me mention one thing, which I think is probably the most important model for schools to understand. And in chapter 4 of the book, and it's encapsulation. Encapsulation is my word for what's been very well understood academically in transformational learning theory and other places, where to turn almost any experience, and here I'm not just talking about like a school or a year or a course, but I'm talking about every individual session of the school, is to encapsulate that experience with preparation beforehand, reflection afterward, and integration on an ongoing basis. And if you spend just a few minutes preparing people for what they're going to learn that day, to put them in the right frame of mind, to priming them for what they're going to have, maybe questions that you're asking them, and then you go through the school hour period, but also including the course of the year. You do this at every level, and then you have reflection afterward. Just asking people, including kids, what were the highlights of this last hour? What were the things that really spoke to me, that mean something to me, that interacted with something else that I'm doing in my life? And how might I use this in the future? What I might do with this, how I might think about it, and so forth. How I might apply it to my general life outside of school. And then reflection all automatically increases the value of whatever the experience was. So it's just the way it works, and what academic research shows. And then integration is that understanding what are the things that really did impact the kids and how you can help them integrate that into their lives on an ongoing basis. And that's one of most all transformation guiders just don't do well enough right now, is integrating what people learn, what they become into their lives.
Maybe if I can jump in and pick up on something I see Kalina's writing in the chat, because I think Kalina's making this point that in some ways, if a lot of transformation occurs through things such as traumatic experiences, when we think about our intentional endeavors within the school context, how do we make that, how do we ensure that has the right consequences? And I guess my aside to that is Colleen's comment has made me think, is it the case that most of us are transformed and become the humans that we are today despite school, not because of school? But I'm wondering whether most of us would say the most transformative experiences we've had perhaps occurred outside the school gate rather than inside. And I'm wondering, Joe, how you'd reflect on that.
Well, I think that's certainly true if you think about them as the proverbial life-changing experience, right? That is one experience. But if you look at the effect that schools have on people over, 12 years of their lives or whatever it is, then the cumulative effect of that is often much greater than those individual life-changing moments. Not always, it's going to depend on individuals and so forth, but the impact that schools have over an incredibly malleable little person to helping them become somebody who's productive in life and live a life of well-being and prosperity with wisdom and meaning. That's an incredible, big transformation that's made up of a lot of series of events, right? A lot of sequences of events to be able to get to that point. Again, just look at where they are at kindergarten, first grade, and look at where they are when they graduate.
So maybe a final question for today. I see Victoria is asking, can you expand on the role parents play in the transformation economy? While parents are the primary consumers, schools are fundamentally designed to serve the students. So what is the role that the parents are playing?
Yeah, and I mean, schools should be designed to serve the students, but with the knowledge of what parents are hoping as well. I mean, there's a generic level of that, but then there's a specific level of that as well. Parents are more fundamental to who people become than schools are, but the only thing pretty much that's more fundamental than schools is who the parents are and how they interact with their kids, how they help them grow and develop, how they help them do their schoolwork, how they they're the ones that are more likely to instill that intrinsic motivation that people can gain over time. And that's why, having a, one parent household can be so less positive for kids growing up. And it's hard for schools to overcome when there's a bad family situation at home, right? It just becomes very difficult to do that, but we need to do what we can to be able to handle that. And it works best when you've got, schools and parents working as partners for the benefit of each individual student.
Was the belief that we are better together. And that was one of the reasons why the Yellow Car community was the first thing that we launched, a place for people to connect, to share, and to celebrate with one another. And the other thing that we knew right from the start was our focus on designing and measuring the experience of school. So today's announcement is building on those two foundations. We are very proud to share two strategic partnerships. One partnership to enhance the measuring side of the experience, and another partnership to further designing that experience. And first partnership is with the Learning Analytics Collaborative by Consilience, a partnership that started with visualizing our enrollment snapshot a few years back. And it's a one-question survey that allows schools to compare their enrollment against global trends. But we always knew there was more to it, because the snapshot is not the only measuring tool that we have. A few years ago, we decided to develop the Felt Experience Indicator, a tool to measure the experience of students, parents, and employees in our schools, asking different types of questions. So we're stepping away from levels of satisfaction around the different services and programs that a school may provide. And instead, we're asking questions linked to happiness, connection, belonging, understanding, confidence, and gratitude. Because we're curious whether different groups of people have different types of experiences, such as the difference between faculty versus staff, or new students versus returning ones, or local parents versus international parents. And we are visualizing that as wavelengths, trying to see where there are dips and where there are peaks in that experience, identifying the topics that might be contributing to where people find value and where they experience friction, and how these topics are changing over time, as well as allowing schools to benchmark themselves compared to other schools. We even wrote a white paper about what we learned from almost 20,000 submissions last year, thousands and thousands of data points. And if you're interested, you can scan the QR code that's right there at the left bottom to download your own copy of the white paper, Listening at Scale. And in the meantime, we've added two new measuring tools to the mix, creating our Yellow Car feedback ecosystem, where we now also have a pulse survey that helps measure the rhythm of the school year for employees, identifying what is working well and what requires strengthening in relation to their work experience, and the student teacher feedback survey. And that is that allows us to measure the student learning experience, giving direct feedback to their teachers, as well as allowing schools to see the trends across divisions, subjects, and grade and year levels. And it is that whole ecosystem that we are now bringing over to LAC, who is designing a bespoke platform for us that combines the outstanding functionality that we already enjoy with brand new features to further enhance that experience for schools. LAC, some of you might know that, is well known in the world of international education. They're serving more than 65 schools across the world, and it functions as both a platform and a dedicated service designed specifically to help schools harness the power of learning analytics to improve and to transform their environments. And with more than 200 different data visualizations, it's something that we can't wait to dive into. Data security is a top priority for them, and for the schools that already host student learning and other data on the LAC platform, they will now have all their data in one place. So we're very excited to see what's to come in the next few months with this building on this strategic partnership. But that's, of course, not the only one. Our second strategic partnership is with Jacob Schultz, who's also here on the call from Bolster Education, who we've been working with for many months now. What started as a yellow car community conversation, trying to simplify communication strategy, resulted in co-designing the communications experience builder with Jacob. And we quickly noticed the potential of using the tool across all domains of school and even industries beyond schools. And so we feel very proud to share the Experience Builder with you. It's a thinking and designing framework in the form of a card deck, 65 cards across 9 dimensions of experience. And these dimensions cover 2 kinds of work: understanding what's happening in the experience, so in other words, seeing that experience, and designing what to do about that experience, shaping it. And what that means is that the top half of the deck, those are the first 5 dimensions: moment, hero, job, friction, and transformation. And that is about seeing the experience clearly. And then we have the bottom half, the other 4 dimensions: posture, action, front stage, and backstage. And this is about shaping that experience deliberately. It is ultimately a thinking tool. So you pick up a card, you ask a question, and you see something that you hadn't seen before. There's no correct starting point, no required sequence, and no single way to move through the framework. And that flexibility is intentional. And there's more on the way, because the card deck is just a starting point. The Experience Builder is growing into a broader toolkit for teams in schools and outside of schools who want to work with experience more deliberately. So if you're just excited about this as we are, also here there's a little QR code that you can scan and you can sign up to be the first when it's ready for pre-order. So that's it. Thank you for joining us today to be part of our conversation with Joe and celebrate with us. And thank you, Joe, for your wisdom, for spending this time together with us. And we hope for everyone it was time well spent.